Hi, I'm Joanna Barnum. I'm a watercolor painter focusing on portraits. In my personal work, I'm really interested in strong emotions and balancing realism with experimentation. I also paint portrait commissions and illustrations for publication. I'll be showing you how to paint your own portrait in watercolor using the provided materials. Basic watercolor technique, how to mix skin tones in watercolor, and how to paint your portrait in layers. Here are the materials we'll be using today. First, we have our Hannah Mule Turner paper, 4 sheets. The 6.5 by 8.5 inch size is good for practicing your portrait skills. We have Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils, which we'll be using to sketch out our portrait before we paint. These are water soluble. We have full-size watercolor tubes of several colors for mixing a variety of skin tones. Van Gogh Naples Yellow Red, Grumbacher Academy Gamboge, Daniel Smith Burnt Sienna and Burnt Umber, and finally Art Creation Chinese White, which can be used for adding opaque details and corrections. In addition to these colors, this custom Daniel Smith dot card includes samples of a range of colors you can add. To use the dot card, you just reactivate the colors on the card with a wet brush. We have a flower palette to hold and mix our paint. For brushes, we have a 3-brush set from Princeton. These round brushes have nice points for control and detail, but the larger brush can also hold a good amount of water and pigment for covering larger areas. You'll also need a container for water and a paper towel. I'll be working from a reference photo of Mike. I find it easiest to print out my reference photo at the same size I'll be working. This makes it easier to do an accurate drawing. I like to choose a reference photo with directional light, either sunlight or from a lamp, to add dimension to the face. Today I'm going to use our Faber-Castell watercolor pencils for the layout drawing. I'm drawing directly onto the final watercolor paper and I'll be painting over this drawing. But you can also warm up and practice on sketch paper first if you want to. I'm going to start with a lighter color and a light touch. I'm sketching loosely with general shapes first. The nice thing about these watercolor pencils is that when I paint, any extra marks from the pencil will melt into the painting. You can also erase these pencils with a white eraser if you need to. Because I printed out my reference at the same size I'm working, I can actually move my reference photo around next to or above my sketch and measure out where certain features should fall on the page using my pencil as a guide. This helps me get my proportions correct. I can also hold my pencil to help me measure angles and relationships between features. Here I'm measuring the angle of the eyes in relationship to each other. I'm always looking at the way different parts of the face relate to each other, things that line up, for example, the inner edge of the eye and the corner of the mouth in this particular view. Comparing things like this help you increase accuracy. Something else to keep in mind is that this is not a fully rendered shaded drawing. This is mostly a line drawing. I might mark the placement of a few shadows for myself, but mostly that'll be done with the watercolor. As I refine the drawing, I'm going to switch colors to something a little darker for final line placement. I can just draw right over my sketchier lines with a more precise one. Remember that any extra line showing underneath will just melt into the watercolor painting since these are water-soluble pencils, so don't worry about them too much. I'm working in a realistic style, but feel free to use the techniques and steps I'm describing to create something in your own style. For example, you could use these same general steps to draw a portrait that is a caricature or animation style instead. The same concepts also apply if you're drawing a model from observation rather than a photo. So we just about have a finished solid drawing here to do our watercolor on top of. I find it really helps to have the proportions and the features all worked out as a sketch before you start painting, since watercolor is transparent. Let's take a break from our portrait to talk about color mixing and practicing watercolor techniques. If you're new to watercolor, it may be helpful to take one of your sheets of paper to practice your techniques and test out your colors before painting your portrait. We use our watercolor paints by mixing some of the concentrated paint out of the tube with water, or in the case of your dot card, by rehydrating some of the paint on the card with a wet brush. You can control how dark or light your color is by how much water you mix in. More paint and less water makes a darker, more saturated color. Less paint and more water makes a lighter color. We can fill in areas of color with something called a wash. This is a shape of continuous wet color. You can use the side of your largest brush to cover the most area. Notice how wet strokes placed next to each other merge together into one continuous wet area. This is mostly how we'll fill in sections of our portrait. You can also have a wash that fades from darker to lighter gradually. You can also use the tip of each brush to make smaller marks. Try practicing the different sizes and shapes of marks you can make with each brush. Dry brush technique is a way of creating texture that is good for hair and beards. I take most of the paint out of my brush with a paper towel and then drag it around against the texture of the paper. To layer color, or to place shapes of different color next to each other, it's important to let the first area dry completely. Otherwise, the paint will bleed together. If you're impatient, you can use a hairdryer. You can also make colors bleed together on purpose with wet on wet technique. When painting a portrait, it helps to look at your reference photo and identify a light warm tone, a medium warm tone, and a cool shadow color. For Mike's portrait, I'm going to use our Naples Yellow Red for the lightest warm tone. For the medium warm tone, I'm going to take burnt sienna and add a little carmine and a tiny bit of Indian Throne Blue. And for the cool shadows, I'll use Indian Throne Blue with a lot of water mixed in. All flesh has some cool tones in it, especially in the shadow areas. Flesh isn't just made up of the more obvious warm colors. The cool tones might be blues, greens, or purples. They're pretty subtle, so don't go overboard. There's no one recipe for the right colors to use to create a particular skin color, but here are a few examples I've put together that might give you some ideas. Now let's get started on our final painting. I'm going to build this portrait in layers, working light to dark. First, I identify the highlights in the face that are going to stay the pure white of the paper so that I can paint around them. Now I'm taking my Naples Yellow Red for my lightest flesh tone and mixing it with water to get the correct value. I'm going to try my best to paint around those white highlights, leaving those unpainted, but if you cover any up, you can always come back later with the opaque Chinese white to add them back in. I'm going to cover the rest of the face with this color as a base. I'm also going to layer it over areas like the eyebrows and parts of the beard where you can see the skin showing through the hair. I'm going to cover the lips except for any highlights too. It's true that lips are pinker than the rest of the face, but I can layer on that pink later. It's important for areas like the lips and the eyebrows to feel continuous with the rest of the face and not like they're pasted on or separate. Don't be afraid to paint over the lines you've drawn. Before I add more layers to the flesh, I'm also going to lay down some base color for the hair, beard, and clothing so I don't have those blank white areas blazing at me. For each area, I'm looking for the lightest color I see in my reference to start with. For the hair and beard, I used burnt umber with a lot of water mixed in. On the right side, where the head is in more shadow, I added some Indian Throne Blue. One thing to notice is how the gray hairs in the shadow areas aren't actually the pure white of the paper. So we're trying to establish that light color right now, and we'll add darker colors on top later. Sections of the beard and hair are a good time to try that dry brushing technique to add texture. I'm also going to take my blue with a lot of water in it, and I'm going to use it to put a shadow over this whole eyeball on the shadow side. If you compare these two eyes, one in sun, one in shadow, you'll notice that the white of the eye is really only pure white where the sunlight hits it. Usually the whites of our eyes are in shadow. If you leave them totally white, they'll be way too bright. The same goes for other white things like teeth. If you leave them the pure white of the paper, they'll be too bright and kind of scary looking. For the background, I'm not going to paint the background from the photo. I'm just going to add some color. You can use any colors you want or more than one. I'm using phthalo blue turquoise. You can paint the whole background or just do a little vignette around the face like I'm doing. I put more concentrated color right next to the face and then blend it out with a lot of water. You'll notice I left that eyelash shape and those beard hairs on the side unpainted. They're really bright with the sunlight hitting them. Before I continue with more layers, I do want everything to be totally dry, so I used a hair dryer to speed it along, or you can take a little break. You just want to make sure that everything underneath is totally dry before you continue. Now I'm going to layer my mid-tone flesh color on top of what I have already. I mixed burnt sienna, carmine, and a tiny bit of Indanthrone blue. Because this portrait has a strong sense of sunlight and shadow, this mid-tone does have a bit of a purplish shadow feeling to it. Look at your reference photo carefully and see what's accurate for you. One thing to keep in mind is that watercolor looks darker when it's wet and looks lighter as it dries. This can take some getting used to, so don't worry if your mid-tone feels a little too dark and bold at first. It'll settle down. Something I love about watercolor is the unexpected textures it creates as it dries. To me, this is part of the beauty of the medium. So as you're filling in larger areas like this, don't try too hard to make everything perfectly smooth. It's better not to go over and over the same areas with your brush trying to smooth it out. That will actually make it look overworked and wear down the paper. Just put the color down and let it do whatever it's going to do. I'm also going to build up some midtones in the hair and beard. So you can see as I go from one layer to the next, I try to treat everything on the page. So I did first all those light layers. Now I'm doing all my midtone layers. And then at the end, we will add darker details. I like to see everything kind of come up together at the same time so I can understand its relationship to the other parts. As I build up the hair and beard, you can see how I'm now also painting around some of those shapes that are the little gray hairs that you see within the darker areas. I used green gold mixed with deep sap green to put in that eye color. And now I'm using our Indanthrone blue to layer on some cool shadows in places such as around the eye. I'm also going to add more pink in places like the lip, cheek, and ear using carmine. I'm going to just layer it right on top of what's there already. This is my favorite part that I'm getting ready for now. I'm going to start adding dark details. The final stage is what really pulls the whole portrait together. You'll notice I don't have any black paint here. We're going to mix all of our own dark colors. Burnt umber and Indanthrone blue mixed together without a lot of water make a really good blackish color. We can also get a dark purplish color with Indanthrone and carmine. Mixing complementary color pairs also works really well to create dark colors. For example, if you mix red or pink with green together. It's good to experiment to see what kind of mixes you can create for dark shadow colors. I'm trying not to make my dark details all the same color. I'm noticing which ones are warmer and which ones are cooler and which ones are almost black. As I paint these details, I'm switching to my smaller brushes for more control. I can paint some individual hairs for detail, but I'm not hand painting every hair on his head or beard. Sometimes I'm using dry brushing, and sometimes I'm painting bigger shapes of light and dark. When it comes to things like eyebrows and eyelashes, it's especially important to really observe your reference and to try to paint what you see. It can be easy sometimes to default to your sort of cartoony mental concept of what you think these things will look like. Little stylized doll eyelashes, which even if somebody has very long eyelashes or false eyelashes, they don't really look like that. You might see a few individual hairs, but mostly it's more of a textured line. You might also pay special attention to how the ring around the iris of the eye connects to the line of the upper and lower eyelashes. Usually you can't see the iris as a perfectly round shape all the way around unless somebody has a very surprised extreme expression. If at any time the paint you've already mixed starts to dry on your palette, you can just add a little more water with your brush and it will become liquid again. Once again, I'm looking for a variety of shapes and lines and textures as I'm rendering the beard. It's not all an even surface of every single hair the same way. I'm going to add in some larger light shadows to add more structure to the face and neck just by layering on more of our mid-tone flesh color from before. Now that we're almost done, I'm going to come back in with the opaque Chinese white and add in any highlights and details that got lost. I can also mix this with other colors. I added a little green with the white to create a small green highlight in the eye. And I mixed the white with blue to paint some of these gray hairs with a small brush. As a final finishing touch, I'm going to add some fun splatters to the background. I'll take a piece of scrap paper and lay it over my portrait to protect the face. I will add a lot of wet paint to my brush, and then I will tap the brush with one finger to splatter the paint. Well, here's our finished portrait. Great job, everyone. I hope you enjoyed trying out this process. We would love to see what you created. If you post your work, make sure to use the hashtag SketchboxPortrait to share it with the Sketchbox community. Happy creating!